I'm going to go over some things that I consider when designing a new build and how I judge how my quad might perform after it's done being built. Now, a big disclaimer here, this entire video is about something that a lot of people will call hogwash, and that's totally okay. This is purely my opinion, my thoughts, and things that I've personally used to compare quads and have seen some consistency that help me do what I do. I really only have two metrics to go on when comparing things, and that's power to weight and disc loading. Both of these numbers are flawed because they don't really represent the real world, but they are real metrics and they do help compare. Power to weight is something that is really hard to nail down because bench tests for thrust are very dynamic. Different people do them, they get different numbers, and it's in general, bench tests don't predict exactly what's happening in the sky. Disc loading is something that in the real world, physics do not scale linearly. If you blew an ant up to the size of a human, it would be almost entirely exoskeleton, or else the whole thing would just implode on itself. So physics just doesn't scale the way we would imagine on our planet. But let's look at these two numbers. Power to weight is pretty obvious. It's how much power you make divided by your all-up weight. And disc loading is a metric that compares the weight of the quad versus the disc area of the quad, the area that all the discs together make. And this is a very easy number to calculate. It's literally just the area of the discs, which is going to be pi r squared times 4 because we have 4 motors. And so when we calculate that for 5-inch, we get a number that is 78.5. Now, the units are obvious, but I'm not even going to put them there to prevent you from being confused by them. The units don't matter. And now let's extrapolate that and calculate the same number for 3-inch, 2-inch, 2.5-inch, and 1.22-inch. 1.22-inch is tiny whoops. So tiny whoop size props are about 1.22 inches or 31 millimeters. Now to me, disc loading is a more important number because it's a better prediction of how the quad is going to perform in terms of handling, agility, and really amp draw too, but that's a really extrapolated topic. A really horrible analogy, but the best thing I could come up with is that if you think about cars or car racing or just car improvements, a lighter car with really, really wide wheels has a better grip to weight ratio than a car that has higher weight with really skinny wheels. And this is a really terrible analogy because it's obviously a lot more complicated in cars, and it's obviously a lot more complicated with these quads as well. But it's something that gives us a hint as to what we're looking at. So first, before scaling down, let's look at these two quads. These are a race quad and a acro freestyle quad. So these are the two primary builds in 5-inch. 5-inch is still the gold standard. That's why I'm using 5-inch as the standard to compare against. And so when we look at these two builds, let's break down the numbers for these two builds. So 5-inch race quad, this day and age, is usually going to be using a 2207 motor or a 2405 motor. These have become pretty much the standard in the industry. And the dry weight of the build is going to be about 280 grams. 250 grams is good. 280 grams just gives you a lot more power, so because you can have bigger motors on there. So that's going to be your dry weight around, and people are now using 1600 milliamp packs 4S or 1050 milliamp packs 6S. So that puts your dry weight at 280 grams and your battery weight at about 180 grams. And that gives you a battery to quad ratio of 64%. Now that's a pretty high number, and it's necessary for racing because you're constantly drawing tons and tons of amps. You need a bigger battery to supply all those amps. That's going to give you an all-up weight of 460 grams, and dividing that by the disc loading number, you get a disc loading ratio of 5.9 for the race quad. Most 2207 or 2405 motors, regardless of the KV, whatever prop combination that goes with them, will give you around 1500 grams of thrust on the thrust bench. Compensating for the KV change of going up to 6S even, you're going to see around 1500 grams of thrust, probably a little bit more with these really high-powered rigs, but let's just stick to 1500 grams of thrust for now. That's going to give you a maximum thrust of 600 grams, and that's going to give you a power-to-weight ratio of 13:1. Now let's look at the acro quad. Your typical acro quad these days is using 2207 motors. Will have around a 340 gram dry weight. Add a GoPro on board, that's 72 grams. It's going to give you a dry weight of 412 grams, including GoPro. Acro quads don't really pull as much amps because we're not going as nuts unless you're Matty Stunts. You're not going as crazy on the throttle, so we like running maybe a little bit smaller packs. I personally like smaller packs, so 4S 1300 or even 1500 packs. Let's average those and say the battery weight is around 170 grams for the quad, which puts the quad to battery ratio at about 41%. The battery is 41% of the weight of the quad. Dividing the all-up weight by the disc loading number gives you a disc loading ratio of 7.4. Now, you can see here clearly that a lower disc loading number is better, but that doesn't really matter, and you'll see why as we move on. Similar motors and props are going to give you similar thrust, and you're going to see a power to weight ratio of 10.3. Now, I know from experience of building a whole bunch of small things that when you scale down, you need to beat these numbers. You can't just match the numbers or it's not going to work out. You definitely need to beat them. And I'm not really interested in racing. I don't think a lot of people are when they're building these tiny little quads. So let's just average these numbers and say we want something in the middle. So if we average the race quad and the acro quad together, we get a quad to battery ratio of about 52%. You want the battery to be about 52% of the quad. And the reason I've gone with that ratio is because your quad weight, it has a lot to do with how many amps you pull out of the battery. And so you need to have the appropriate size battery to be able to handle the amps. Now, of course, higher power motors are going to pull more amps, but this is just general. These are just general numbers, just general thoughts. If you average a disc loading number, you get 6.65, and if you average the power to weight, you get 11.65. Now that we have these numbers, we can simplify the expected weight for the size prop that we're going to be using by just multiplying the disc loading number by the disc loading ratio. So I've done that now here on the side for you. You can see that for optimal handling, control, disc loading, performance, whatever that might be, these are the weights that you want to hit. You want your quad to be around this weight. Now, these numbers are actually very meaningful and have a lot built into them. So the optimal disc loading performance that I felt for a 5-inch quad is around a 250 gram dry weight with about a 160, 170 gram battery. But going up to 280 grams dry weight allows for a lot bigger motors, a lot more power, and a lot more potential for me without a lot of loss in agility. So that's primarily what I'm basing it on. Now, acro quads naturally carry more weight because they have to carry a GoPro. On top of that, we want more protection because if we crash into stuff, we don't want to deal with rebuilding stuff. Whereas race quad just wants to be as light as possible and have the best performance. We prefer not to waste our time. So we'd rather the quad be a little bit more reasonable. Now let's add to that the expected battery weight, which is 52% of the quad's weight, and the expected power to weight ratio of 11.65. And now we have a set of metrics to actually go against when we're shrinking things down. And we know we need to match these numbers or do better than these numbers to get similar performance. So the first thing I want to consider is what's coming out soon, which is the RunCam Split Mini, the Mini RunCam Split. Now, the Split, I personally don't think the Split is a very good product. I don't think the quality is very good. I think the field of view is very poor in the FPV feed. It's not ideal, unfortunately. The Mini version is going to be hopefully better because it's a different camera, so they had to find a different lens. So hopefully they fixed the field of view issue for the actual FPV feed. And it's smaller, so the board is 20 by 20, so it'll actually fit into smaller quads. So I'm going to build a quad around the Mini Split. I want to have the smallest possible quad with the same performance that I'm getting out of my 5-inch big quads, but in this small, tiny package. So my payload is the camera, which Oscar Lang will tell you weighs 14.5 grams. Let's add half a gram because he didn't include the standoffs and other stuff. So 15-gram payload, that's what we want to carry. We want to have good performance. Now, I've already done a bunch of research, so I'm just going to give you the build that I'm planning on doing in the future, but let's go over it. Here are the component weights that I'm expecting. RotorX recently came out with their 1107 motor, which is a superpower motor. It weighs 8.5 grams. Add screws to that, about 9.5 grams. Props are going to be about 1.25 grams, including screws or whatever. Your stack is going to be a 20 by 20 stack, which the Emax stack weighs about 8.5 grams. Let's add a little bit of hardware onto that, about 9 grams. Your receiver is going to be about 2 grams. Your VTX, you probably will want a little bit more of a substantial VTX than one of those tiny little ones. And the VTX will probably need to have a BEC on board because you're going to be running 3S and 4S. So that's going to be about 5 grams. And then you have an antenna, which you're probably going to have something on there that you solder on or whatever. It's going to be about 2 grams. Frame will be roughly 18 grams based on the design that I've already done, the designs that I've already done working with these numbers. And then let's add 6 grams for fun because of all the battery straps and whatever. So that gives you a dry weight of 100 grams, which is pretty good. 100 grams to work with. Now, this particular quad is going to want at least a 3S 600 milliamp battery. Of course, it's going to work on 2S, but you really want that 3S performance. If you want to get any kind of power to weight, you want to have that 3S performance. So a 3S 600 milliamp pack is probably going to be the right size for those motors, judging on the amps that they draw. And that kind of a pack will weigh about 55 grams, which is perfect because it gives us a battery to quad weight ratio of 55%, which is exactly in the ballpark that we want. The Rotor X 1107 motors, based on Engineer X's thrust test, give you a whopping 420 grams of thrust on 3-inch and 3S, and 350 grams of thrust on 3S and 2.5-inch. Now let's backtrack a little bit and look at our all-up weight and compare that against our disc loading numbers. So our all-up weight is going to be about 155 grams, and when you compare it to the disc loading numbers, we want 130 grams for optimal performance on 2.5-inch, and we want 188 grams or less for optimal performance on 3-inch. So we know that we need to beat these numbers. We need to match or beat these numbers. So we're going to skip 2.5-inch because that's not going to work out for this particular build that I've designed. And we're going to go straight to 3-inch. So when you look at 3-inch thrust test for this motor and you compare the power to weight, you get a 10.8 power to weight ratio. Now that's not 11.65, but the resulting quad will probably weigh a gram or two less, and it'll be a little bit better, and it's pretty close, and the disc loading number is actually lower than the optimal numbers that we've calculated. So that will also make up for the lack of power to weight a little bit. So this is the build that I am expecting, and this is the frame weight that I'm expecting to have once I'm done designing it. So that should perform pretty similar to my acro quad, to my 5-inch acro quad that I have here, although it probably won't be as fast because it's smaller, it's running 3S, depends on prop pitch, depends on a lot of other factors, really hard to gauge, but it should have similar performance. I also don't know how throwable or launchable or how far it will soar because it is a lot lighter. It's 150 grams, and I bet drag doesn't scale linearly either, so I wouldn't expect it to be able to have the same kind of soar time, but it should be reasonable. At least it shouldn't fall like a rock, like some of these 1407 3-inch builds that have an all-up weight of like 400 grams, which is pretty ridiculous for 3-inch props. I don't like them because it feels like I'm flying a rock. It feels like I'm flying a rock with a lot of power, but it still feels like a rock. It doesn't really handle. You got to bank a lot more to make your turn. It doesn't feel as nice. Let's take this a step further and extrapolate a little bit smaller. So let's look at a nano quad. Now, the nano quad is the first, or whatever I'm calling the nano size, which is just a smaller quad than the split mini quad. Now, getting down to the size, again, I'm just going to look at what I require in this quad. What I require is, number one, good performance, and number two, I really hate to give up my micro FPV cameras. They give a far superior view compared to the super duper little micro tiny cameras, and it's just a standard. And now we have these micro cameras, and they only weigh 5 grams, so this quad really can carry that weight. On top of that, I like having good footage, and there's now, well, not now, it's nothing new, but there are some VTXs that have DVRs built in, and having a DVR on board doesn't weigh much, and it gives you cleaner, at least it gives you video without static. So it's a little bit more usable if you want to do something with it. So a camera, a micro FPV camera weighs about 5 grams, and a VTX with a DVR in it with the antenna and everything is going to be about 8 grams. Scaling down for this build is going to be 1105 motors, which is very reasonable. You're going to have props for about a gram because they're a little bit smaller. Maybe we can run 2.5-inch props, so let's cut a quarter gram off that. 16 by 16 stack is going to be adequate for 2S. Hopefully we don't need to go up to 3S, but we will see once we're done with the numbers. The receiver is again going to be 2 grams. Frame will be roughly 10 grams, and then let's add 5 grams for fun. That gives us a dry weight of 60 grams. Now if you look at the battery ratio of roughly 52%, we know we have more than 30 grams of battery weight to work with, and that's going to give you around a 400 milliamp 2S battery, which is roughly 35 grams, which puts it right in the ballpark of the battery ratio that we want. With that 35 gram battery, that's going to give you an all-up weight of around 95 grams. Now let's look at our disc loading ratios, and that's going to be too high for a 2-inch to have really good performance. So we're going to jump to 2.5-inch. But now we see we have a 35 gram headroom. Let's continue with the numbers and see if we need to change things around a little bit. A 1105 motor on 2.5-inch and 2S will give you about 190 grams of thrust. So that's going to give you a thrust to weight ratio of about 8, which is kind of somewhat low. It's kind of farther below the 11.65 number average that we came up with, lower than I'd like to see. Now the quad is pretty light with pretty big props. It's pretty far below the 130 gram target that we have for 2.5-inch props. So that will make up for the lack of power to weight ratio. But I don't know, I really like having a good power to weight ratio as well. So let's see what happens when we move to 3S. Now these 16 by 16 millimeter stacks will not really handle 3S very well. but let's just leave everything the same as is and see what happens to the numbers when we do move to 3S. Now, let's just go with a 400 milliamp 3S pack, which will add a little bit of weight. It'll be about 45 grams and put our all-up weight to 105 grams, which are still well below the disc loading number that our target is. And the motors will now be putting out about 240 grams. Again, these are all based on Engineer X's numbers. And that will give us a power to weight ratio of about 8.7, which is not really that much more than 8, but it's still a significant number. So something needs to change in this build. And this is a good example of a build that might need a little bit of work, or you can just build it and see what happens, see what it will turn out to. And this is what I mean by experience of building a whole bunch of little tiny things and seeing how they perform. I've done all this kind of experimentation and looking at all these numbers for a while now, and I haven't really gotten a craft that I like flying until more recently, when all the technology kind of improved a whole lot and we got micro cameras and things started to get a lot better for micros and just in general. The last mini split quad that I went through was a much closer match to the numbers that we wanted to get, and this quad is it strays a little bit farther than I personally want to see, so I'm going to have to work with that build. And I did these two to show you, one that needs a little bit of work and you might need to reconsider compared to one that is appropriate. But now let's go a step further and shrink it down a little bit more. Now let's just look at my quad here, my brushed quad. And this is a funny little quad, and let's just talk about the numbers. So the quad weighs 50 grams all-up weight with a 500 milliamp 1S battery. And it's running 2.6 inch props. They're not even 2.5 inches. 66 millimeters is actually 2.6 inches. And so for 2.5 inches, our weight target is 130 grams. So we're way below our weight limit for such large props. And that's why it kind of starts hovering when I arm it, because it's just so darn low. But then when you compare the power to weight ratio, each motor is only putting out about 45 grams at best. So the power to weight ratio is 3.6 at best, which is so far below the 11.65 that we want to see. But because our disc loading is so drastically below our target, it makes up for it quite a bit. And it really doesn't have good performance. It's pretty terrible performance, but it's flyable and it feels really nice in the air because the disc loading number is so low. These numbers are, again, they don't translate fully, they don't scale fully, but they just give you ideas. And so just interesting to see what it turns out to. And something that I personally don't have any real expertise in, let's look at the tiny whoop. So tiny whoops are about 30 grams. The all-up weight of a tiny whoop is about 30 grams. And each motor on these tiny little props that are 1.22 inches. Now let's look at our disc areas again. When you go from 3 inch to 2 inch, you're going down by about a third in prop size, but you're losing a little more than half of your disc area. When you go from 2 inch to 1.22 inch, which is very similar to going from 3 inch to 2 inch, you're losing almost 2/3 your disc area. Now, something pretty interesting that I've heard from multiple prop manufacturers independently is that they really don't like making props that are super tiny because they just don't work very well. And the number that that two companies independently have told me is 2.4 inches. And 2.4 inches is kind of the minimum that they want to make, because once you drop below 2.4 inches, it starts becoming really, really inefficient. And you start losing a lot of disc area much faster. So clearly we see there is no linear relationship here. Everything is very complicated. All that being said, a tiny whoop only weighs 30 grams all-up weight. And the disc loading number that we have, if we extrapolate down, is 44 grams. Now again, it's not linear, and you need to beat these numbers when you're going down in size. But still, 30 grams, 44 grams were well below the disc loading number that we're kind of expecting if we think it's a linear relationship. Unfortunately, the motors only put out about 30 grams of thrust. So our power to weight ratio is still at best 4-to-1. And that's why these things are really hard to fly in acro mode. If you have a really tip-top tiny whoop with the best motors and the best everything, and it's all good to go and your batteries are charged and they actually hold a charge and they're not just like drooping like crazy, the best you can do is around 4-to-1 power to weight ratio, which is flyable in acro. But if you're running stock motors, your motors are a little bit old, you've been through about 30, 40 cycles of flight, and they're kind of bogging and your battery's not doing too well, all of a sudden you start dropping grams of thrust real fast, and it becomes really tough to fly in acro mode, and you kind of just got to stick with auto level mode, or else you'll just fall out of the sky if you tilt too far sideways. So again, these are just some things that I look at when I'm designing quads and when I'm considering components and how I want to put things together, and particularly when I design frames, I look at what the frame weight needs to be, and then I do a whole bunch of testing to see if I get the durability that I'm looking for. So a lot of work goes into all that. It's a lot of fun, but it's a lot of work as well. And yeah, that's it. I hope this was interesting. I hope this was informational. I hope it helps you. And don't forget to floss, because that's always important. And sorry if this video upset you. I'm just sharing my thoughts and my ideas. That is all. Happy New Year.